There comes a moment in every empath's life when something inside them goes completely silent. Not broken, not angry, just done. Carl Jung discovered this wasn't depression or emotional exhaustion. He called it the final stage of spiritual awakening, and it terrifies everyone who witnesses it, because when an empath stops caring, they don't become cruel, they become untouchable, and that changes everything. Jung spent decades studying patients who reached this state. What he found challenges everything we think we know about empathy, spirituality, and personal transformation. The moment the empath stops caring isn't the end of their journey. It's the beginning of something far more powerful. And understanding why this happens might be the most important psychological insight you'll ever encounter. Today I'm going to show you what Jung discovered about the final letting go, the 3 things empaths release that transform them completely, and why this phase is simultaneously the death of who they were and the birth of who they were always meant to be. Carl Jung observed something in his practice that disturbed him for years before he understood what he was witnessing. His most empathic patients would arrive week after week, drowning in other people's emotions, desperate for relief. Then one day they would walk in completely different, not healed in the way he expected, changed in a way that made him deeply uncomfortable. They had stopped caring, but not in the way you think. What Jung discovered was that the moment an empath truly lets go isn't a breakdown. It's a metamorphosis so complete that the person who emerges bears little resemblance to who they were before. To understand the final letting go, you need to see what Jung saw when he looked at unhealed empaths. He didn't see sensitive people who needed to toughen up. He saw individuals whose psychological boundaries had been violated so systematically from such an early age that they never developed a normal sense of where they ended and others began. These weren't adults who learned empathy. They were children whose survival depended on reading every micro shift in their environment. The daughter who had to sense when her father was about to explode. The son who learned to absorb his mother's depression so she wouldn't harm herself. The sibling who became the emotional translator for a family that couldn't communicate without destroying each other. Jung understood these empaths weren't born this way. They were created, forged in environments where their own emotional reality had to be sacrificed to manage the emotional instability of the adults who should have been protecting them. So they learned to disappear themselves, to become whatever the room needed them to be. But here's what Jung found most tragic. By the time these empaths reached adulthood, they had completely forgotten this was a defense mechanism. They believed their lack of boundaries was virtue. They interpreted their compulsive caretaking as compassion. They mistook their inability to prioritize their own needs as spiritual evolution. And everyone around them reinforced this delusion, because empaths make life easier for everyone else. They absorb the conflict so families don't have to address dysfunction. They manage the emotions so workplaces don't have to create healthy cultures. They carry the shadow so friends and partners don't have to face their own darkness. Jung saw through all of this, and he knew that for an empath to truly heal, something would have to break so completely that they could never go back to the role they'd been performing since childhood. Jung documented that the final letting go never happens gradually. It happens in a moment of such profound disillusionment that the empath's entire worldview shatters. And that moment almost always involves seeing clearly for the first time how much they've been used. Not just used by one person, used by everyone. The entire social structure around them has been designed to extract their emotional labor while giving nothing back. And the empath suddenly sees all of it. Every manipulation, every exploitation, every time someone took and took while calling it love. But here's the twist Jung discovered. The shattering moment isn't when the empath discovers others were using them. It's when they discover they were volunteering for it. They were the ones who taught people how to exploit them. They were the ones who accepted breadcrumbs while calling it a feast. This realization is devastating because it destroys the victim narrative. You can't blame others for treating you the way you train them to treat you. The empath has to face something more painful than betrayal, their own complicity. They have to acknowledge that their compulsive helping was often about their own ego needs, not the other person's well-being. That their endless availability was actually a way to feel indispensable because they didn't feel valuable otherwise. That their absorption of others' pain was sometimes about avoiding their own. Jung called this shadow integration, and it's excruciating because the empath has built their entire identity on being the good one, the helper, the one who cares more than anyone else. To see the selfish motivations hidden beneath that altruistic facade requires a level of honesty most people never achieve. When the empath finally accepts their role in their own exploitation, something inside them doesn't soften, it hardens. Not with bitterness, but with resolve. They make a decision that feels like ice forming in their chest. Never again. Not said with drama or threat. Said quietly to themselves in the deepest part of their psyche where vows actually stick. Never again will I betray myself for someone else's comfort. Never again will I light myself on fire to keep others warm. Never again will I accept love that costs me my peace. Jung identified what he called the 3 deaths that occur when an empath truly lets go. And understanding these deaths is crucial because everyone around you will interpret them as you becoming cold, damaged, or broken. But Jung knew these deaths were necessary for psychological rebirth. The first death is the death of who you thought you were. The empath has to kill the version of themselves that derived all meaning and value from being needed. If you're not the helper, the fixer, the one everyone turns to, who are you? When the empath truly lets go, they allow this identity to die. They stop answering every call for help. They stop inserting themselves into other people's problems. They stop believing that their value is measured by how much they can endure for others. This creates a terrifying void. Without the constant demands of others to distract them, the empath has to sit with themselves. And often they discover they don't know who they are. Jung said this void must be tolerated. You cannot skip this part. You have to sit in the emptiness until something authentic emerges from within. The second death is the death of the belief that if you just love people hard enough, eventually they'll love you back the same way. This requires accepting that some people are fundamentally incapable of reciprocity. The empath has a degree of relationships that never were what they thought they were. They have to accept that their parent will never suddenly become capable of emotional support, that their partner will never magically develop empathy, that their friend will never stop making everything about themselves. Jung noted that empaths often mistake potential for reality. They see what someone could be and relate to that fantasy version while ignoring who that person actually is. The letting go requires killing the fantasy person and seeing the real person clearly. The third death is the death of the story that made the suffering meaningful. The belief that all this pain was building towards something, teaching something, purifying something. The empath has to face that maybe it wasn't. Maybe it was just pain. Jung found that many empaths constructed elaborate spiritual narratives to make sense of their suffering. It was karmic debt. It was their soul's purpose. These stories made the pain bearable by giving it meaning. But the final letting go requires releasing these stories too. Because as long as you believe your suffering serves a higher purpose, you'll keep volunteering for it. These 3 deaths clear the ground completely. Nothing remains of the old identity, the old hopes, the old stories. The empath stands in psychological rubble with no idea how to rebuild. And this is exactly where Jung said they needed to be. What happens after the 3 deaths is what made Jung so uncomfortable. The empath enters a state he called the silence. Not the peaceful silence of meditation, the hollow silence of someone who has completely withdrawn their emotional investment from the outside world. They stop calling people, not out of anger, just lack of interest. They stop attending events, not to punish anyone, but because the energy required to maintain false connection feels unbearable. They stop explaining themselves because they've realized most people aren't actually listening. To outside observers, this looks like depression, but Jung recognized this wasn't depression. It was detachment. The empath was finally, for the first time in their life, not engaged in the exhausting work of managing everyone else's emotional reality. They had unplugged from the emotional matrix, and in that unplugging, they discovered something shocking. Most of what they thought was their personality was actually just responsiveness to others' needs. Strip away the helper role, and a stranger emerged, someone they'd never met. Jung observed that this silence phase varied in length but was non-negotiable. Some empaths needed months, some needed years. Because in this silence, something crucial was happening. The empath was learning to hear their own voice. Not the voice that echoed what others wanted to hear, but the raw, unfiltered voice that had been buried under decades of accommodating everyone else. This voice said things the empath had never allowed themselves to think. I don't actually like most of my family. This friendship has been one-sided for years. I stayed in that relationship long after I stopped loving them. These thoughts felt cruel at first, but slowly they learned to let the hard truths exist without diluting them, to acknowledge what is without rushing to excuse it or explain it away. During this silence phase, the empath's entire social circle usually panicked. They interpreted the withdrawal as a cry for help, and doubled down on trying to pull the empath back. But the empath had become unreachable, not because they'd built walls, but because they'd stopped responding to the hooks. Before we continue, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises, inspired by the teachings of Carl Jung, designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get true self-discovery. Eventually, the empath emerges from the silence, but what comes out is so different from what went in that Jung hesitated to even call them the same person. He described it as psychological rebirth, the death of the false self, and the emergence of something authentic that had been suppressed since childhood. This reborn empath possesses 3 qualities Jung found both remarkable and unsettling. The first quality is ruthless discernment. The emerged empath has developed what Jung called ruthless discernment. They can assess a person's character within one conversation. They can predict how a relationship will unfold within 3 interactions. They know exactly who is safe and who isn't. But here's what makes this ruthless. They act on this knowledge immediately. No second chances for people who show them who they are the first time. No benefit of the doubt for patterns they recognize from past exploitation. This looks cold to people used to empaths giving infinite chances, but Jung understood it as health. The empath has finally learned to trust their perception instead of overriding it to maintain relationships that hurt them. The second quality is strategic availability. The reborn empath is no longer accessible to everyone at all times. They've learned to ration their empathy like the finite resource it is. They're present for people who have earned that presence through consistent reciprocity. This creates a tiered system that might seem calculating, but Jung saw it as wisdom. Not everyone deserves the same level of access to your time, energy, and emotional capacity. The reborn empath is still capable of profound compassion, but they have learned to ask, will my involvement actually help this person, or will it enable them to avoid facing what they need to face? And if the honest answer is enabling, they step back. The third quality is unshakable sovereignty. The reborn empath has become psychologically self-contained. They don't need external validation to know their truth. They don't need others' approval to make decisions. This sovereignty makes them difficult to manipulate because the usual leverage points don't work. You can't guilt someone who no longer operates from guilt. You can't shame someone who has made peace with their own shadow. Jung observed that this sovereignty often gets misread as arrogance. But it's not arrogance. It's the natural consequence of a person who has finally stopped seeking themselves in others' eyes. The reborn empath moves through the world completely differently. They enter rooms without immediately scanning for who needs help. They have conversations without absorbing the other person's emotions. They maintain relationships without sacrificing their own needs. Here's what Jung discovered about empaths who complete this final letting go. They develop a form of psychological power that's almost frightening. Not power over others, but power over their own reality. That makes them immune to the mechanisms that control most people. They can't be manipulated through their emotions because they're no longer unconsciously driven by them. They feel everything, but they're not controlled by what they feel. They can sit with discomfort without needing to fix it. They can't be controlled through obligation because they've released the belief that they owe anyone anything beyond basic human decency. They've stopped confusing love with debt. They can't be guilted into compliance because they've made peace with being called selfish. They understand that every boundary they set will be labeled selfish by someone who benefited from them having no boundaries. This power manifests in how they handle conflict. Where the old empath would have absorbed the tension and tried to make everything okay, the reborn empath lets conflict exist. They state their truth and let others respond however they respond. But Jung offered a crucial warning. The reborn empath is in danger of overcorrection. Having spent their entire life with no boundaries, they risk building walls so high that nothing genuine can penetrate. The challenge becomes learning the difference between healthy boundaries and total closure, between protecting your energy and hoarding it, between ruthless discernment and cynical dismissal of everyone. The goal, Jung emphasized, isn't to stop being empathic. It's to become consciously empathic. To use your sensitivity as a gift you control rather than a wound that controls you. This requires a delicate balance, staying open enough that genuine connection is possible while maintaining boundaries strong enough that exploitation isn't. Remaining compassionate without reverting to compulsive caretaking. But the work is worth it, because on the other side of this final letting go, the empath becomes something extraordinary. someone who can hold space for enormous depths of feeling without being drowned by them, someone who can love profoundly without needing to save. What happens when someone successfully cuts off family and completes the psychological work isn't just healing from the relationship. It's a fundamental transformation of how they relate to all relationships. Having learned the hard way what happens when boundaries don't exist, they develop the ability to set and maintain them with surgical precision. They know their limits. They communicate them clearly. They enforce them without guilt. This doesn't make them cold or closed off. It makes them safe. They can be vulnerable with people who've earned trust. They can be generous with people who respect reciprocity. But they're impenetrable to people who want access without earning it. Years of being gaslit by family taught them to doubt their own reality. But walking away and discovering they were right all along, this validates their internal knowing in a way that changes everything. They stop seeking external validation for their truth. They know what they know. They trust what they feel. They believe their own experience. This makes them very difficult to manipulate because you can't convince them to doubt themselves anymore. Jung observed that people who cut off biological family often create the deepest, most authentic relationships because they know the difference between real connection and obligatory performance. These chosen families are built on mutual respect, reciprocity, and authentic care, not on guilt, obligation, or genetic accident. Every person who successfully completes this transformation creates permission for others trapped in similar situations. They prove that letting go is possible, that you can survive the guilt, that building a life without certain people is not only possible but potentially better. Jung believed this ripple effect was crucial. Each person who breaks the cycle makes it slightly easier for the next person. Each individual who chooses authenticity over obligation shifts the collective consciousness just slightly. Here's what Jung discovered that will fundamentally change how you see this final letting go. The empaths who complete this aren't the ones who failed at love. They're the ones who love themselves enough to stop participating in their own destruction. They looked at the choice between maintaining connection and maintaining their sanity, and they chose sanity. They recognized that love that requires your self-betrayal isn't love. It's captivity with a pretty name. Jung saw this final letting go not as a failure, but as a profound act of psychological health. It's the individual recognizing that their life belongs to them, not to the people who demand their sacrifice. That their primary obligation is to their own well-being, not to maintaining dysfunction for the comfort of others. This doesn't mean they don't love these people. Many empaths who let go still love from a distance. But they've recognized that love doesn't require proximity. That you can wish someone well while accepting they're not safe for you to be around. Society will judge you for this choice. They'll call you cold, ungrateful, damaged. They'll say you'll regret it. They'll insist you should work it out. Jung would tell you that this judgment reveals more about society's need for you to stay unconscious than it reveals about your choice. Systems built on empaths absorbing dysfunction need you to believe that your sensitivity obligates you to sacrifice. That being empathic means you owe everyone access to your energy, regardless of how they treat you. People who let go threaten this system. They prove that you can survive outside these dynamics. That chosen boundaries can be stronger than inherited obligations. And this threatens everyone who's staying in toxic situations out of guilt. If you're an empath in this final phase of letting go, if you've reached the silence and you're terrified because you don't recognize yourself anymore, Jung would tell you, This is exactly right. You shouldn't recognize yourself. The you that you were was built to serve others at your own expense. That you needed to die so the real you could finally emerge. The real you was never meant to be everyone's emotional support system. The real you was never meant to sacrifice everything to keep peace in systems that should have collapsed decades ago. The real you was never meant to love everyone at the expense of loving yourself. What you're experiencing isn't a breakdown. It's a breakthrough into a way of being that most empaths never achieve because they can't survive the deaths required to get there. You had to let go of your helper identity, your hope for reciprocity, and your noble suffering narratives. And that letting go is creating space for something you've never had, a self that belongs to you. The silence you're in right now is necessary. Don't let people rush you out of it. Don't let them convince you that your withdrawal is a problem that needs fixing. You're not hiding from life. You're finally, for the first time, finding yourself beneath all the layers of who everyone needed you to be. And what you'll discover there might surprise you. You might not be as nice as you thought you were. You might not want to help as many people as you thought you did. You might not actually like some of the people you've been maintaining relationships with out of obligation. These revelations aren't evidence that you've become a bad person. They're evidence that you're becoming an honest one, someone who can acknowledge their true feelings instead of performing the feelings they're supposed to have. Comment below, "I am sovereign," if you're in this final phase and you recognize what's happening to you. Like this video if Jung's framework helped you understand that what you're experiencing isn't damage, it's transformation. Subscribe for more content exploring the psychology that society doesn't want you to understand